On the afternoon of July 24, 1944, Colonel Kiyoshi Ogata stood on an island he believed he understood. Tinian was only 51 square miles, a small piece of coral and sugarcane in the middle of the Pacific. But to Ogata, it was a fortress. He had spent months preparing for the moment when the Americans would come. He had studied every island battle that came before him. He had watched Japanese garrisons die on beaches. He had watched commanders repeat the same mistake again and again. So he made a decision. He would not defend Tinian where the Americans expected him to. He would force them to fight through a defense built to survive. His weapons were positioned. His artillery was registered. His men were ready. The Americans would have to attack the fortress he had created. But Ogata had made one assumption. The Americans would fight the battle he prepared for, and that assumption was about to destroy everything. Because across the ocean, American commanders were looking at the same island. They saw the same beaches, the same defenses, the same obstacles. But they saw something Ogata did not. A weakness hidden inside his strength. The Japanese commander had built his defense around the places an enemy would normally attack, so the Americans decided not to attack there. They chose the places no one believed were possible. And that decision would change the fate of the island before the first major shot was fired. For Ogata, the problem was simple. A commander could survive a powerful enemy. He could survive overwhelming firepower. But he could not survive an enemy who changed the question. The question was no longer, how do we break through the Japanese defenses? The question became, what happens when the Japanese defenses are protecting the wrong battlefield? Ogata had learned it from every Pacific battle before Tinian. At Toriwa, Japanese forces defending the beaches were destroyed under American naval fire. At Saipan, a massive garrison fought for months before being overwhelmed. The lesson seemed obvious. A commander who waited at the shoreline would die there. So Ogata chose something different. He moved his strength inland. He built layers. He prepared artillery positions in mortal locations. He created a defense designed to absorb an attack and keep fighting. His decision was logical. His decision was disciplined. His decision was exactly what the Americans expected. Because while Ogata was preparing for the obvious battle, American planners were studying something else. They were studying what he had ignored. 2 narrow beaches on the northwest coast of Tinian. White Beach 1. White Beach 2. They were not impressive. They were small, too exposed, too difficult. No commander would choose them for a major invasion. That was exactly why the Americans chose them. The decision carried enormous risk. If the landing failed, thousands of Marines would be trapped against a prepared enemy. But if it worked, the Japanese defense would collapse before it could be used. The Americans did not need to defeat every gun. They needed to make every gun point in the wrong direction. And to do that, they needed Ogata to believe the attack was coming somewhere else. On the morning of July 24, the deception began. American landing craft moved toward Tinian Town Beach, the location Ogata had prepared for, the location where his strongest defenses waited. From the Japanese command posts, it looked like the attack had arrived. The enemy was coming exactly where expected. Ogata made his next decision. He moved his reserves toward the false landing. Thousands of Japanese troops began shifting south. The defense reacted. The fortress knew, and in doing so, it created the opening the Americans needed. Because while Japanese forces moved toward the fake assault, Marines landed on White Beach. Almost unopposed, the impossible beaches became the real battlefield. The moment Ogata understood the deception, the battle had already changed. His men had not been defeated. His weapons had not been destroyed. His positions still existed, but they were defending a past version of the war. Ogata made another decision. He ordered his forces to reverse direction. The reserves would move north. They would attack the Americans before the beachhead became impossible to stop. But now the Japanese soldiers had to cross open ground, and Tinian offered them nowhere to disappear. The same flat terrain that prevented the Americans from being trapped also exposed every Japanese movement. Aircraft followed the columns. Bombs and machine guns struck troops moving between positions. The defense that had been designed to control the battlefield was now chasing it. By nightfall, Ogata faced a new problem. The Americans were ashore. Their equipment was arriving. Their position was growing stronger every hour. He had one chance left. Destroy them before they became permanent. So Ogata made his most dangerous decision. He committed his tanks. 12 Type 97 Japanese tanks moved forward into the darkness. The plan was simple. A sudden armored attack against a newly landed enemy. Break the beachhead before it could harden. The decision was bold. But the Marines were waiting. The Americans had expected this possibility. Anti-minus tank teams were positioned. Sherman tanks were ready. The Japanese attacked a battlefield that had already been prepared for them. One by one, the Type 97 tanks were destroyed. The counterattack ended, and with it disappeared Japan's ability to take back the initiative. Ogata still had soldiers. He still had weapons, but he no longer controlled the pace of the battle. That was the moment Tinian really began to fall. Because an army can't survive losing ground. He can't survive losing equipment. Or it cannot survive as losing the ability to decide what happens next. The Marines understood this. They refused to slow down. On previous Pacific islands, defenders often gained time. Time to rebuild positions. Time to prepare new lines. Time to turn every cave, ridge, and valley into another battlefield. But Tinian gave Ogata none of those advantages. There were no mountains, no deep tunnels, no terrain that could stop an advancing army. Only fields, roads, and open ground. The Marines made another decision. They would keep moving. They would not allow the Japanese garrison to recover. Every captured position immediately became the starting point for the next advance. Every delay was removed. Every Japanese defensive line was attacked before it could become stronger. Ogata's original plan had depended on space. Trade ground. Slow the enemy. Lead them. But now the island itself worked against him. The battlefield was shrinking faster than his soldiers could adapt. His communications failed. His supply routes disappeared. His remaining forces were pushed farther north. The commander who had spent months preparing every possible answer now had fewer and fewer choices. By the final days of the battle, Ogata was no longer trying to win. He was trying to preserve what remained. The decision that had begun as a strategy for victory had become a struggle for survival. Tinian fell in 9 days. A Japanese garrison of roughly 9. Zero men had disappeared from the island they were ordered to defend. But the story of Tinian did not end when the fighting stopped, because the same thing that made Tinian difficult to defend made it valuable to the Americans. Its flat terrain, its open fields, its location. The Americans had not only captured an island, they had captured a platform. Within months, the sugarcane fields became something Ogata could never have imagined. Massive runways, fuel storage, aircraft facilities, a base designed for a new kind of war. The island that had been a fortress became an airfield, and from those runways, B-29 bombers would fly missions that would decide the final chapter of World War AI. On August 6, 1945, B-29 aimed an Ola Gale lifted off from Tinian. It carried a weapon unlike anything the world had seen. The aircraft departed from ground that Japanese soldiers had died trying to hold. They had fought for an island. The Americans had fought for what that island could become. That was the hidden meaning of Tinian. Ogata believed the battle was about stopping an invasion. The Americans understood it was about creating the next move. The Japanese commander did not lose because he failed to prepare. He lost because preparation could only defend against a future he could imagine. The Americans won because they chose a future he could not. 9,000 soldiers defended Tinian. 9 days later, they were gone. But the decision that defeated them was made before the first Marine reached the shore. It was made when someone looked at the impossible beach and decided that impossible was exactly where they would land.